Okay, Idamix Ganatani, Nidanigo Sakweping. My name is Dr. Lana Potts, and it is my pleasure to be here with you today and to be your host for this webinar. Today is part 3 of the Settlements and Cultural Safety and Inclusiveness Training. We're going to be talking about child welfare policies and child removal history. This was a part of the training that really is going to dig deep into looking at where we came from and how did we end up here and how did we end up with this settlement, because the settlement comes from children being removed. So we're going to go back through history. We're going to look at some information, and we have a very dynamic speaker who's going to be sharing her lived experience. She was a frontline worker. She actually has a journey that absolutely needs to be shared. So we really thank you for joining us over this next 90 minutes. Just a small disclaimer that the information shared in this training and on our website is for general purposes only and does not represent the views or opinions of Deloitte. Just our little thing. And this will also be posted in the chat. I'd like you all just to take a big breath today. Can we ground ourselves with grounding work? It's always important. My friend Robert shares with me 5 breaths. He tells me, Lana, do 5 breaths before you begin. Begin with the first breath in to allow ourselves to be present. The second breath in to allow ourselves to be aware. The third to let things go. The fourth to bring in good energy. And the fifth to begin. And I say this because this topic, as we go forward, can be very triggering for people. It can be triggering to hear the stories. It can bring up emotions. It can bring up thoughts maybe we might have forgotten about. It may remind us of events that have had happened or stories we've heard in our communities or stories that we deal with in our front line. So it's very important to know to take care of yourself if you notice that it's triggering a trauma response, if you're feeling a bit, anxious, if you know if you need to step away, that's okay to do that. The videos will be recorded and you can come back and watch them. Also, if you need to chat with someone or talk or reach out, there is immediate help available to Indigenous people across Canada. And this is available 24 hours a day. And this is actually a line that I've even reached out to find out for more information. It's called the Hope for Wellness, and you can contact them at 1-855-242-3310. You can also connect with them online and chat at hopeforwellness.ca. There is counseling available through English, French, Cree, and Ojibwe. And then also for children and youth, if you're wanting some connection with for young people, the Kids Help Phone is also available, and you can reach them at 1-800-668-6868. So just a reminder to be aware, always to take care of ourselves first. So this is part 3, and if you were able to join us in the last couple of days, you would have heard an introduction to the settlement. So what is this settlement agreement about? What is the history? What are all the classes? And yesterday we had a remarkable discussion with Dr. Patricia Makokis talking about the history of colonization and the impact of residential schools. We add to this foundation of knowledge today, looking at our child welfare. Where did it come from? What are our policies? What does child removal history mean? And the significance of us understanding why it's important for us to be aware, because it's such a huge part of understanding how we got here and what we're going to do to move forward. And we have a remarkable speaker here today, and we'll introduce her shortly. So who am I? My name is Dr. Lana Potts. I've introduced myself earlier. I'm a director here at Deloitte, but I'm also a family doctor, and I work at Asukanaki Clinic in my community part-time. I have grown up in my community and had been raised in several backgrounds, and I have a real passion to try to improve. And my goal is to help people understand what happened to us and how then through what happened to us do we move forward. And so I'm really grateful to be hosting. I've had a lot of input in putting together these sessions, and tomorrow you'll be hearing from me a bit of my perspective. But most importantly, I'd like to turn things now to a lady that I have admired my entire life. Um, I know her as Francine Monroe, Pretty Badger Woman, is a remarkable human being who leads with courage, who leads with hope, and who has really demonstrated the idea of pushing forward. Fran in her life, would not have been with us if had not we hadn't adopted in an extended family. So I grew up with her, and she has probably led the way for me to even be here. She went to school and I admired her. She's a mother, she is a grandmother, she's a leader in our community. She's a ceremonialist who actually protects all of our people and has done that for many years in her life. She also is a huge child advocate. And if nobody advocates for kids more than Fran, in our culture, we call her Granny Franny as an term of endearment because she is a grandmother to many and has been as at a very young age. She's an epitome of love and hope, and I'm so grateful that you can be here with us today. She's an accomplished and educated woman. She carries a master's in social work, and we're so grateful for you to be here with us today with your knowledge and to share with us your story. And so I turn things over to you, Francine, for you to share the child removal history and looking at how we then move forward. So thank you, Fran.
Well, thank you. Thank you. I'm so honored. Um, I would like to start by acknowledging our blessings, our elders for blessing us with your presence today. I would also like to acknowledge the survivors of the residential school, those affected by the Sixties Scoop and the child welfare system. It is important that we honor our ancestors, land, animals, and everything that is of spirit. And last but not least, our children who have yet to come home. I appreciate the opportunity to share my personal and professional experience with you. I will share stories related to my father, a survivor of residential school, and my experience as a child of a residential school survivor. It is also important that I share my first significant loss and how that led to my experience of the 60s scoop and the foster care system. I will also bring you through how I became a social worker delivering child protection services through a Western service delivery, and my personal experience and understanding of why our people are struggling with the opioid crisis. And to end my time with you, I will share how I decolonized and became an Indigenous social worker that knows the value in connecting our children, youth, and families to our Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing so they can live a good life of balance and harmony. We have stories to tell, and it is time to share our stories as it is also a time to heal. My presentation will begin on child welfare policies and child removal. Next slide. The timeline here displays a brief history of child removal and policy changes starting with the Indian Act. In the slides to come, I will elaborate on this timeline. Please keep in mind the years of trauma our people had to endure, but also be mindful of how resilient we are. Next slide. In 1920, the Indian Act was amended to make day or residential school compulsory. Duncan Campbell Scott, a deputy superintendent of Indian Affairs in 1913, wrote, and I quote, "The happiest future for the Indian race is absorption into the general population. And this is the object and the policy of our government, assimilation." So the reasoning would solve the Indian problem and wrenching children away from their parents to civilize them into the residential schools until they were 18 was believed to be a sure way of achieving the government's goal. He also was known for his statement, and again I quote, "I want to get rid of the Indian problem. I do not think, as a matter of fact, that the country ought to continuously protect a class of people who are not able to stand alone. Our objective is to continue until there is not a single Indian in Canada that has not been absorbed into the body politic, and there is no Indian question and no Indian department. That is the whole objective of this bill." Next slide. This is the picture of some of our people prior to Indian residential schools. who Duncan Campbell Scott thought to be the Indian problem. The statement, kill the Indian and save the man, is another quote that has been known in our history and serves as a reminder that we are still here. The picture displayed is of Big Face Chief and his wife, and Little Wolf as the young boy. Little Wolf, my father, was abruptly removed from his traditional heritage in hopes to civilize him. This was the last time he's seen his grandparents alive. Next slide. Displayed here is a picture of my 84-year-old father, Little Wolf, who attended school in BC, where the 250 unmarked graves of children were found. My father, who is a fluent speaker in our language, can no longer hear out of one of his ears due to the physical abuse he endured because of speaking the only language he knew while attending residential school. As a 7-year-old boy, he did not know where he was brought to other than being across the mountain area. It took my father a long time to share his experience of residential school. And although I do not know the extent of his abuse, what he did share has had a traumatic influence in my life. I recall his words that day, quote, "I need to share with you kids why I wasn't able to be there to raise you when you were small. I know this day would come that I would need to share my story so you can understand," unquote. My father did not need to get into details as I seen it in his eyes as he held back his tears. I heard it in his voice when he choked back his words. It was then that his pain became my pain. His tears became my tears. I understood how our family and our other families were disrupted by this system, as it prevented the transfer of our cultural beliefs to my generation and the generations to come, my children, and now my grandchildren. His loss of identity, his kinship, and his inability to share his language with us is something that we are still actively restoring today. Next slide. At the closing of the residential school, the Indian Act was amended, resulting in the Sixties Scoop. The Sixties Scoop was another child welfare policy that involved the removal of the Aboriginal children from their homes. The Department of Indian Affairs indicated that the number of children taken between 1960 and 1990 was 11,132. However, upon recent research, it is reported that more than 20,000 First Nations, Métis, and Inuit children were scooped from their homes and sent as far away as New Zealand. As a child protection worker in my community, we frequently received calls from individuals who were in search of their family. Some did not know who they were, and the only information they had was that they were from our nation, or that they might be from our nation. It was quite sad that we were not able to assist some of them, but we would refer them to our membership office or Catholic Church, who may have records to help them. Being on the receiving end of these calls, I was reminded of my own personal experience of the 60 Scoop. In 1974, my mother died, leaving behind my father and 6 children, all under the age of 12. I recall workers coming to our door and my father telling us to go hide. They eventually got in and already had placements available for us, separating us into twos. It was a sad day for me, as this was the first time in my life I knew what fear was. Prior to that, I only knew love and affection that was shown to me by my parents, siblings, and my extended family. One of the homes we were in did horrible things to us. In particular, stripped my sister and I's clothes off outside and threw us in a snowbank. I was first, and as I climbed out of that snowbank, I cried for my sister as I seen them swinging her and letting her go. I was only 5. They laughed at us as we stood there naked, and all I knew was that I had to do what I can to protect my 4-year-old sister. I would whisper to her to not cry so we did not get into trouble and be locked in a closet. I recall holding her close to me and taking on the responsibility to protect her. We were eventually moved after a visit from my father and sister, who made an unannounced visit to the home and found us in that locked closet. Although this is hard to hear, it is the reality of a lot of us. I openly share my story in hopes that others will release the pain and shame that does not belong to us. Through that unannounced visit and my father taking off with us that day, my sister and I eventually were placed with family who loved and adored us. Next slide. Unfortunately, Richard Cardinal is not here to tell his story about his experience of the 60 Scoop, but did leave a diary of his multiple placements while in the care of the child welfare system. Richard, a young 4-year-old Métis child, was removed from his home. He had been placed in 28 different foster homes, group homes, and shelters in Alberta by the time he was 17 years old. At 17, he decided that taking his own life was the only way to end his suffering. The Richard Cardinal story is a documentary that is difficult and disturbing to watch, and yet it is so relatable. He too shared a similar experience of him and his brother being asked to remove his clothes from the waist down to be whipped in front of his foster sisters. His story is a 29-minute documentary that is attached here, and if you wish, you can pull it up on the link provided, or it can be found online. Next slide. All Richard wanted was to go home, and unfortunately, this only happened when they brought his body back to his community. Richard's death sparked a provincial government inquiry, which offered 22 recommendations for improving how courts, the provincial government, schools, hospitals, Aboriginal organizations, and media deal with foster children. It called for childcare workers and foster parents to be trained in our culture, suicide, and depression. For governments to establish mental health facilities for children and the recruitment of more Aboriginal child welfare workers and foster parents. Next slide. I recall back in 1990, a family member who was a social worker had received a call to pick up some children from a home. I was immediately brought back to my childhood and asked if I could tag along. I was curious about what happened to these children because of my own experience, so I began asking questions. What do you do with these children you're removing? She said they are placed in a home in the community until they can go home. I wanted to be that home. I did not want another child to go through what I went through. It was not long after that that I became a temporary safe home for Indigenous children. It was my first experience as a worker providing care to our children. In 1999, I got a job in my community as an assistant to the band consultant at the Social Development Office. This role allowed me the opportunity to meet with child family service agencies off the reserve and for non-Indigenous workers to consult regarding a child of the band. In 2002, the late Sandra Greer worked hard to establish a delegated First Nations Child and Family Services for our nation. This was done so our own people can serve our own people. In my early years as a child welfare worker under the Child Welfare Act, I was sent to delegation training in how to deliver child welfare services through the province. I recall that this was the first time hearing about the Richard Cardinal story and wanted to do my best as a worker to help our children and our families. It was hard working under the system as I seen how the policies changed throughout the years. With so many policy changes and expectations of reporting, my time with the children became less and less, and I spent more time with the computer than I did with my families. In 2004, the Child Welfare Act changed to Child Youth and Family Enhancement Act. The description of what the Child Youth and Family Enhancement Act is, and I quote, "The Child Youth and Family Enhancement Act provides authority for child and youth services to provide services in support of children who are abused, neglected, or otherwise in need of intervention. As a last resort, the Act allows for children to be apprehended if they are not if they're not safe in their own homes. The Act also deals with adoption of children, including government adoption, private adoption, and international adoption," unquote. Next slide. Birth alerts. Birth alerts are notifications that flag expected parents to hospitals in advance of a child's birth, when it is believed that the newborn may be of risk and in need of protection after delivery. Birth alerts are typically issued by child welfare workers without the knowledge or consent of the expectant parents. The alert prompts the hospital staff to contact child welfare authorities as soon as the baby is born and could result in the baby being removed from the care of its mother. What ends up occurring, mom avoids prenatal care, may have a secrecy pregnancy. I do know of one particular story. When I first started in children's services, there was a birth alert that had occurred, and what happened at the time was the mom was so scared she abandoned the baby in the hospital, and the baby ended up being diagnosed with failing to thrive. Um, what what we ended up having to do was we got in touch with a caregiver that took the baby in and provided the baby with the nurturing to assist the baby to thrive. In the executive summary on missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls calls for justice for all governments, 12.8 states, we call upon provincial and territorial governments and child welfare services for immediate end to the practice of targeting and apprehending infants, hospital alerts or birth alerts from Indigenous mothers right after they give birth. Next slide. The Yukon, British Columbia, and Alberta stopped the birth alerts in 2019. Manitoba and Ontario ended the practice the following year. Saskatchewan stopped using birth alerts early in the 2021, with New Brunswick, Newfoundland, Labrador, and Nova Scotia following that year later. Data obtained by the Canadian press through Freedom of Information requests that show that 496 newborns nationally were taken into care in 2021 in regions that had ended birth alerts. And I just want to share a video with you.
The woman's newborn was taken away from her by police and social workers in 2019. A video of that seizure was live streamed on social media. The baby was the subject of a birth alert. Child welfare agencies take infants shortly after birth in hospitals. The woman says in the statement of claim that birth alerts are unlawful and cause significant harm. Manitoba stopped using birth alerts in 2020. The province says they cannot comment on the matter as it is before the courts. A similar lawsuit was filed in BC last fall.
And back to you, Fran.
Thank you. So yeah, I just wanted to share another story with you in regards to the birth alerts that I actually I actually was notified while being in office that we had a young mom who had two children that were previously in care and had their third child. I was directed by my supervisor to that we needed to apprehend because this mom was transient, and this mom was also struggling with addictions. It really affected me that, you know, I had to go in because it should have been a joyous moment for this young mom. But unfortunately, due to the circumstances of her living conditions and her having nowhere to go with this infant, we ended up, I was directed to apply for an apprehension. I thought that was too intrusive, and I had asked if I can allow this mom to at least go through a custody agreement, giving her that opportunity to maintain custody, joint custody with the department, and work hard with her to try get her children back. We we went that route after she really did a lot of harsh words to me. She told me, you know, as soon as she said, I just had my baby. My baby's not even 24 years old, and you're already here. How do you know that how did you know that I had my baby? And she said, I can't even have my children, and you guys come along and take them. I sat there next to her. I allowed her to vent. I allowed her to share her story, and I let her know that I would do my best to try to help her. Um, Happy ending to the story. Mom did everything that she could. We actually were able to extend the permanent guardianship order for a whole year because I did what I could to go to the courts and convince the judges that every little thing that this mom was doing was an effort to her restoring her health and her healing. Even reporting to the point that, oh, I got a bed and breakfast, and this is where I'm staying. I can't afford a phone, but I got a walkie-talkie so I can talk to my husband, and they would bike to work. And so I really seen, because they believed in what I shared with them, I believed that they could do it, and it took a whole year. And it's really uncommon practice for a judge to allow um, a PGO status to go on for a whole year. But because of advocacy and getting to know your families, relationship building, trust is what allowed us to get to this point. To this day, this mom and dad have had another baby that we were not alerted on, and ended up what do you call? They have their own home. They have two vehicles. She went back to school and she's thriving. So I just wanted to share that with you. Next slide. So for sterilization, Forced sterilization is the involuntary or coerced removal of a person's ability to reproduce, often through a surgical procedure referred to as a tubal ligation. Forced sterilization is a human rights violation and can constitute an act of genocide, gender-based violence, discrimination, and torture. Female sterilization is a permanent medical procedure that prevents pregnancy. In the first half of the 20th century, eugenetic ideology informed sterilization practices in Canada. The sterilization was influenced by the work of Francis Galton, who coined the term eugenetics. Eugenetics is based on the belief that you can improve the qualities of the human species by encouraging the reproduction of those considered fit and discouraging the reproduction of those considered unfit. A supervisor of social services at Easondale, a provincial institution housing people with various mental conditions, recommended the sterilization of one Indigenous girl in the following way. Patient is mentally defective Indian girl who has always been incorrigible, wild, undisciplined, and promiscuous. Sterilization is, therefore, strongly recommended to prevent patient from having illegitimate children, which the community would have to care for, and for whom it would be very difficult to find foster homes. The full extent to which Indigenous people were affected is unclear. However, it is known that in 1928, Indigenous people were being classified as mentally unfit. And this was often a first step to sterilization. These documents also show that between 1971 and 1974, at least 551 sterilizations were performed on Indigenous women in federally operated Indian hospitals across Canada, which serve primarily Indigenous populations. In 1926, Adolphe Lorenz of Vancouver stated, "We are allowing more and more of the poor human stock to survive and reproduce." Sterilization was the best method to decrease this number of feeble-minded being produced. Once the feeble-minded were sterilized, the problem cured. Senator Yvonne Boyer, who participated in the study of the forced and coerced sterilization in Canada, said she heard from hundreds of people who have been victims of coerced and forced sterilization. One victim from our neighboring tribe expressed being tied down and smelling burnt flesh. She did not sign forms to consent to the sterilization. This is a real issue that is happening today as we speak, and it is not one of the past, said Boyer, as she most recently heard from an Indigenous mother in December who was sterilized without her consent. This is still ongoing as the information was most recently shared in February of 2024. I have another video I'll share with you.
Nicole Awashish was 18, in labor and about to have a C-section when she signed a form she didn't know would prevent her from getting pregnant again. She told her story to Radio-Canada's Enquête. Awashish learned what it was a few years later when she wanted to have another child. Her story is one of many emerging across Canada in recent years. A new Quebec study documents the cases of 22 Indigenous women who say they underwent imposed sterilization between 1980 and 2019.
Sometimes it was hidden during other procedure. We have a testimony. It was a lady, she was getting an operation for her bladder, and 3 days later her doctor says to her, oh, by the way, I performed a hysterectomy.
When we hear things like that, that the people are not believed and, they're not heard and they don't have that voice. And, we wanted to give that voice to the women.
A Senate report on forced and coerced sterilization earlier this year pointed to its long history in Canada and records indicating disproportionate targeting of First Nations, Métis, and Inuit women.
I would say that it adds to the chorus.
Elisa Lombard is a lawyer in a proposed class action suit that began in Saskatchewan. She's heard from more than 100 Indigenous women in Canada with a range of allegations around forced sterilization.
Any remedy that can come about, no matter how financially significant, will not fix what has been lost. But what we can do is correct the system.
The Quebec report recommends all organizations listen to and believe women who speak out about imposed sterilization, and that the Quebec government recognize systemic racism. The province's Health and Indigenous Affairs Minister said what the women in the report described is unacceptable and that they'll look into the findings. Alison Northcott, CBC News, Montreal.
Thank you. You know, when I was doing some of this research, I was reflecting back on some stories that were shared to me, and of women that couldn't have kids, and they also wondered why they couldn't. And when I would question what happened, and they didn't know. And so I kind of, my mind went to wondering if this is, maybe what had happened to them. And but unfortunately, they're no longer here to check into that. Next slide, please. So the TRC, the TRC's mandate. The TRC's mandate is to document the history and lasting effects of the residential school system. Survivors share their experience during public and private meetings across the country over several years. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada was unique. The commission, established by the Indian Residential Schools Settlement Agreement, spent years traveling across Canada to hear from Aboriginal people who had been forcibly taken from their families and placed in residential schools for most of their childhoods. It was reported that the commission received testimony from almost 6,000 individuals, the majority of whom had endured the experience of living at the schools. The commission's focus on truth was to intend to lay the foundation for the question of reconciliation. Getting to the truth was hard, but getting to reconciliation will be harder. Reconciliation will take some time. In the executive summary report, I quote, "Although Aboriginal people and cultures have been badly damaged, they continue to exist. Aboriginal people have refused to surrender their identity. It was the former students, the survivors of Canada's residential schools, who placed a residential school issue on the public agenda. Their efforts led to the negotiation of the Indian Residential School Settlement Agreement that mandated the establishment of the Residential School Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. The survivors acted with courage and determination. We should do no less. It is time to commit to a process of reconciliation by establishing a new and respectful relationship. We restore what must be restored, repair what must be repaired, what must be returned." Next slide. This slide is on Jordan's Principle. Jordan's Principle was established by First Nations in response to the death of a 5-year-old Jordan River Anderson, a child from Norway House Cree Nation who suffered from Carey-Feynman-Sitter syndrome, a rare muscular disorder that required years of medical treatment in a Winnipeg hospital. After spending the first 2 years of his life in a hospital, doctors cleared Jordan to live in a family home near the hospital in Winnipeg. However, the federal and provincial governments could not resolve who was financially responsible for the necessary home care. For over 2 years, the government of Canada and Manitoba provincial government continued to argue while Jordan remained in the hospital. In 2005, at the age of 5, Jordan died in the hospital. He never had the opportunity to live in the family home. In 2005, the First Nations Child and Family Caring Society released the We Are Coming to the Light of the Day report. Drawing on a term of researchers, the report provides a holistic and detailed review of the Government of Canada's First Nations Child and Family Services policy and sets out recommendations for improvement. The research found that jurisdictional disputes continue to have significant impacts on the lived experiences of First Nations children, particularly those with disabilities. Among the policy recommendations, the report recommended that Jordan's principle be adopted by the Government of Canada and the provincial territorial governments. In June 2015, the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission made Jordan's principle the third of its 94 calls to action for governments in Canada, stating, "We call upon all levels of government to fully implement Jordan's principle." In November 2018, the Alberta government signed a MOU, a Memorandum of Understanding, on Jordan's principle with the First Nation Health Consortium and the federal government. In June of 2019, the National Inquiry into the Indigenous Women and Girls Calls for Justice, 12.10, calls for the federal and the provincial territorial governments to immediately implement Jordan's principle for all First Nations status and non-status children. Jordan could not talk, yet people around the world heard his message. Jordan could not breathe on his own, and yet he has given breath of life to other children. Jordan could not walk, but he has taken steps that the government are now just learning to follow. Cindy Blackstock, Executive Director, First Nations Child and Family Services Society. Next slide. The Canadian Human Rights Tribunal. The tribunal established in 1977 through the Canadian Human Rights Act. It is directly funded by the Parliament of Government and is independent of the Canadian Human Rights Commission, which refers cases to the adjudication under the Act. The tribunal holds hearings to investigate complaints of discriminatory practices and may order a respondent to a complaint to cease a practice, as well as an order a respondent to pay commission to the complainant. Decisions to the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal are reviewable by Canada's federal court. The federal court decision can be appealed to the Federal Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court of Canada. The federal court can be an issue and enforce decisions made by the tribunal if violations continue and imprison an offender for contempt of court if the decision continues to be disregarded. In September 2019, at the request of the AFN, the CHRT issued a decision ordering the government of Canada to pay eligible First Nations children and their parents and caregivers $40,000 in compensation. Included in the decision were First Nations children on reserve and in Yukon who were removed from their homes from 2006 onwards, and First Nations children who were denied the essential services and other supports they needed or received after a delay. Because the Government of Canada applied a narrow interpretation of Jordan's principle, the Government of Canada sought judicial review of the decision, but it was upheld. Canada has appealed this decision to the Federal Court of Appeal, but has opted to negotiate that resolution. So this is just some of the history in regards to that. Two class action lawsuits were also filed, including one by the AFN and another by the Musqueam Trout, seeking compensation for First Nations children and family members who were discriminated against through underfunding of the First Nations Child and Family Services Program and narrow application of the Jordan's Principle. These class actions concerned compensation back to 1991, which means they cover more First Nations children and caregivers than the CRT orders. In the fall of 2021, the Government of Canada agreed to enter into negotiations to settle the class action lawsuits. Next slide, please. The United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, or UNDRIP, is about recognizing and respecting the human rights of Indigenous people. The United Nations Declaration provides a framework for reconciliation, healing, and peace, as well as harmonious and cooperative relations based on the principles of justice, democracy, respect for human rights, non-discrimination, and good faith. The Act creates a lasting and action-oriented framework to advance federal implementation of the UN Declaration in consultation and cooperation with Indigenous. It ensures sustained and continued effort to uphold the human rights of Indigenous people now and in the future, and contains measures to hold the federal government accountable. The legislation also responds to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission to Action 43 and the National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls calls for justice. In this way, the Act provides a clear vision for the future, ensuring that moving forward, federal laws reflect the principles and rights set out in the UN Declaration, while also respecting Aboriginal and treaty rights recognized and affirmed by the Constitution. Next slide. The settlement agreement. The AFN and the First Nations Child and Family Services filed a Canadian Human Rights Act in February 2007, alleging that the government was discriminating against First Nation children and families by underfunding the First Nations Child and Family Services Program on reserve and the Yukon, and by applying a narrow interpretation of Jordan's Principle, which I basically already said. In 2016, the Canadian Human Rights Tribunal agreed with the complaints in a landmark decision and ordered the federal government to end its discrimination, immediately reform the First Nations Child and Family Services Program, and fully implement Jordan's Principle. The year since this historic decision, the CRT has issued more than 13 non-compliance orders because the Government of Canada has not been following the CRT's orders. April 5th in 2023, Ottawa, Traditional Algonquin Territory, Ontario Indigenous Services Canada, a revised final settlement agreement now totaling more than 23 billion was reached by the Assembly of First Nations, the AFN, Musqueam and Trout class action plaintiffs, the First Nations Child and Family Services Society in Canada, to compensate those harmed by discriminatory underfunding of the First Nations Child and Family Services Program, and those impacted by the federal government's narrow definition of Jordan's Principle. We honor the victims and survivors of Canada's discrimination in Child and Family Services and Jordan's Principle. Next slide. So now I'll speak about two community initiatives that are very impactful in our communities. The first is the Asiganaki, sorry, Lana, clinic, which is committed to offering medically appropriate, culturally secure, and accessible care to any Indigenous person and their family. The clinic has helped tremendously in addressing and assisting the opioid crisis, especially during our state of emergency. The clinic, Dr. Lana Potts and her team of medical assistants had brought in another expert in expertise or doctor into the community and would go from home to home, assisting those that were struggling, as well as distribution of the kits to help protect them if they're active users. This clinic is an Indigenous-based service and is available to our community, addressing all areas for ultimate well-being. Listed here some brief services that are available, such as walk-in urgent care, family physicians, women's health, elder connections, Indigenous therapists, ceremonies, mental health awareness and programs, women's health specialists, building connections for the community to restore our old ways, outreach services, traditional plants, medicinal healing. Extra effort is made to reach the clients that are immobile, and medical staff and the team are seen at the schools delivering programming in different agencies. Dr. Lana Potts is the founder and the director of this essential service. Next slide. The second community-led initiative I will bring to light is the Indigenous social work program. But before I do, I'll share a story about what led me to this program. On December 23rd, 2016, I lost my oldest daughter in a motor vehicle accident. My life took a major shift in priorities, in my abilities, and my awareness. I already worked in the field of child protection for 17 years. I took some time off work to process my loss. I was angry and had a lot of uncertainty. I was on short-term leave and then long-term leave, and getting paid time off through my insurance. It was a lot to deal with when my insurance would continuously check on me and insisted that I needed a medical diagnosis in order to keep paying me for my leave. They told me if I was prescribed anything from the doctor for depression, and I said no. They said, well, even if you get antidepressants prescribed, get them filled out because we're going to check and see if you did. I told them I don't take pills. They said, well, just pick them up so it looks like you are needing them. I didn't understand why, so I did what they said. I actually tried them out once and eventually threw them in the toilet because of how they make me feel. 6 months, or maybe didn't make me feel. 6 months into my grief, I was informed that Dr. Betty Bastine was providing an Indigenous Bachelor's of Social Work program. The curriculum she designed was coming to know your place in the universe, to decolonize, to do Indigenous-led social work, bringing ceremony into the workplace, the connections to the land, to the language, and to ceremony. I learned so much from this lady who continuously stated that we need to embrace our ways. I recall days where she would be like, you're not embracing this information. And although I went to ceremonies and I met with elders, she informed us that we still needed to embody this information. It did not occur to me until my last year of this program that I actually started understanding what embodiment meant. And that was me stepping in front of my smudge box in prayer and asking for that direction, or asking for that guidance, or asking for that information on why we had a certain ceremony. And to show me these things in my dreams. I would share these stories with her and she would be like, yes, you're embodying this information. What I did was I continued on that practice from that point on, and it's really changed my life to this day. Through the 2 years that I was there, I developed programs for my practicum learning and utilized our value system in my teachings. However, in the meantime, as I went back to work, working all day and attending classes evenings and weekends, I noticed things shifting in me and seeing how colonized I was in my role as a child protection worker. Next slide. This was when my eyes opened and I started seeing the effects of child removal and some of our children going through an identity crisis. They were being raised in non-Indigenous foster homes that had no connection to the land, our elders, protocols, and ceremony. Most of them did not have traditional names and were separated from their siblings and their family. I realized I was working under a system that was created by others and not our own. And through visiting with elders, I began hearing about how people raise their children. As I was a part of a social work task force that interviewed parents and grandparents on traditional parenting. In 2019, I graduated from the Indigenous Bachelor's Social Work program and applied for a one-year secondment as a family finding worker who worked with non-Indigenous workers in investigation, case management, planning. The importance of this role was to assist workers in relationship building, family finding, and connections to our culture. I attended homes with workers and seen the anger of our people as they slammed the door on us. I would interview them alone and inform them as to why there was child welfare involvement. And the main message I received was that they did not trust non-Indigenous social workers. I wrote reports and made recommendations on relationship building, but most importantly, understood why there were so many children apprehended and left in care. Our people refused to build relationships, but did not trust, refused to open the door, would go into hiding, and would at times refuse to send their children to school due to the fear of them being taken. Their failure to comply often led to the determination that they are not willing to alleviate the concern, oftentimes resulting in the worker getting assistance from the police or a court-ordered apprehension. I seen how the child protection workers were not trained nor understood the harms that were caused by the residential schools and the Sixties Scoop. Upon returning to my community as a worker, I seen the number of children increase in the child welfare system. A lot were orphaned, abandoned, or exposed to the opioid addiction. Many were on the streets and others were struggling to maintain sobriety due to limited support. Next slide. The overdose problem is one of the most severe public health emergencies our nation has encountered. Since 2016, there have been 44,592 opioid-related deaths. Despite ongoing efforts at all levels of government and with partners across the country, 8,049 people lost their lives to opioids in 2023. That's an average of 22 people dying each day. January of 2024, my community declared a state of emergency due to the amount of young people dying from the overdoses. My immediate family alone lost 5 people in 1 year to addiction, including a sister and her daughter, my niece, in a 10-month span. Our membership had dropped significantly, and what is more affecting is that the population loss is those of childbearing age, leaving a gap between the child to the grandparent and no parent in between. The picture here is of my late daughter, Delene Sky. And the picture And the other picture is of her and her only child, Aaron, who I now raise. When Deline passed, my time was spent hiding in my home. My boys turned to the streets and engaged in the opioid use. I could not understand why they would be out there when they had a home that provided everything for them. I spent every free time going to the city to look for them. I was so overwhelmed and yet so determined to save them. In the meantime, I was in school and maintaining a job. There were many times I would find them and bring them home only for them to end up back on the streets because of the lack of support and services. I was getting tired of chasing them. It was an uphill battle. And so when they would not come home with me, I would pray for them to go to jail, especially if it was cold and snowing. One time in particular, I had gone to the streets to find my son, and I had already made an appointment with the medical doctor to see him so that he can go into detox. And when I got there, I found him, I put him in the vehicle. He was really upset with me. And he's like, Mom, and this child, my children don't disrespect me despite them going through what they're going through. And when I had him in the vehicle, he's like, Mom, I don't want to go, okay? I got too many things to do. I don't want to go. Just leave me. And he walked away. He shut the door. He walked away. And I sat there and I cried. I had to be at school that evening. And so I had to run all the way back home to get my books. And I went straight to my smudge box. And I was like, Creator, it's so cold outside. It's snowing. Can you just please put him in jail so I know at least he's warm and he's fed and I know where he's at? From there, I left to go to class, and it was just so weird because 20 minutes after I called, my daughter was in the city, and she's like, Mom, I just went around the corner and Peter was getting picked up by the police. And I was like, what? And she's like, I said, drive over there right now and give them your phone. And like I had any control. And so she did. She gave them the phone and got me on the phone. I was on the phone with them and I told him, what are you doing? And why are you picking up my son? And he's on warrants and he's going to have to go in. And I was like, okay. I hung up and I was just like, then it just dawned on me like, oh my gosh, I prayed for this. I didn't even know if I should be happy or relieved or what, but he was in there for 2 weeks. So I basically had 2 weeks of rest, and he called me to come and pick him up. So I made him his favorite supper and he came in and I told him, son, I have something to share with you. And he said, what? And I told him, remember when you didn't want to come with me to go to the doctor's appointment? And he's like, yeah. I said, well, I actually prayed for you to go to jail. And he's just laughed. He's like, Mom, I probably needed it. And I said, you know what? I needed it. And so with that, I'm gonna share a video with you that I wrote and I put into an iMovie just to kind of give you a reflection of my journey and the way I've seen things. So
Trail of Tears Divided. We began our journey together of hardship and tears. When we lost a precious being we loved for so many years, we both looked for relief of a pain we felt so deep. I sought out a doctor, and you sought out the street. Mine was prescribed, and yours you could not describe. For a brief time I could not feel. This was so surreal. Who would have known where our paths would lead? As I threw away mine, you developed a need. I sought out healing, and you began dealing. I cried for your pain that you chose to maintain. You continued this agony of loss and grief as I began finding some relief. I searched for you to show you the way. I knelt down and cried when you chose to stay. I got tired of chasing, and you had charges you were facing. As a mother, I felt cheated as I watched you behind the bars, defeated. I went to a ceremony and prayed. When you're confined, I wished for you to stay. At least I was happy knowing, especially when it was snowing. Where did you choose to go that hangs your head so low? The path I chose is healing. Come enjoy this content feeling. It is important to pray. It will help you find your way. I will never leave you, my son. Our journey is not done.
Thank you for watching that with me. I created that video back in 2019 as part of one of my classes that I had. And because they wanted to understand the difference between the social issues that we were experiencing and our methods of healing. Next slide. I just have a couple of slides left here. I endured the struggle from 2016 to 2024, having 3 children addicted to these drugs. I spent many years, months struggling to bring them home, battling systems that did not coincide with those that were reaching out for help. As a mother, when I called our local detox centers to get my sons in, I was told that they could not talk to me as they were adults, even though they were laying on the couch as I struggled to keep them awake. What was frustrating was when they were told to call back at 8 a.m. to see if there was any space available. How many of them had a phone, and let alone a sense of time? I questioned these policymakers because they obviously did not have a loved one that was struggling. I wondered how they got involved in this. And I was reminded of when I was at the funeral home making plans for my daughter. When I was done, I went outside and proceeded to back up my vehicle. My niece stopped me and asked if I was okay. I told her that I was, and she said, "No, you're not." She began digging into her bag and pulled out a little white pill and told me to take it. It would help me to not think about this for a while. And it would also allow me to rest. I told her I don't take pills. She said, "Just take it, Auntie, it will help you." I opened my hand, took it, and watched her walk away. Threw it out the window. My niece gave me a huge awareness that day as I questioned, is this what happened to my boys? Did someone come along and give them a pill and told them to take it that they won't feel for a while? I felt bad thinking about my niece as she did her best to help with what she knew. That's all she knew. It was not her fault. She was only trying to help. I began reflecting on what tools were put in my toolbox to cope and looking at what tools I gave my children to cope. There was nothing. No one taught me, so I had nothing to give. I had nothing to pass on to my children. No wonder why they ended up in this addiction. In my educational journey, I began learning of our value system and realized these are some of our tools that should have been transferred to us. But because of the residential school system, Sixties Scoop, and foster care, we never received them. They were never transferred to us. My reconnecting to our ways opened my eyes, and I began using prayer to assist me in bringing my children home. I called upon their spirit and started seeing them with restored health and happiness. I made vows and went back to ceremony. I realized that I did not have to go through this alone, as our Indigenous ways, elders, ceremony, land, ancestors were still here. This is what brought my children back home. This is what restored their health. This is what contributed to their healing. And this is what is giving us back, Suksabat a good life. We need to embrace our ways. Next. We all have a responsibility to ensure our children learn of our ways to go back to their value system. Through this, my identity has been restored. And for as long as I live, I will ensure my children, grandchildren, and generations to come will know of our way. This Indigenous framework was created by a group of Indigenous Masters of Social Work program students, Bita Bastine, Leslie Wells, Gay Naki, and myself. And the framework is designed to show our ontological responsibilities, our value system, learning how to embody and embrace them, and having those lived experiences and to be able to speak about that good lived experiences. When we know of these things, then we can transfer that on to others. We can say that to be true, giving us that good life. In honor of my late daughter, Deline, who left my life too soon, but left me with a new journey of awareness. In honor of my mom, who gave me unconditional love and affection. To my father, who does his best to restore our ways, our language, but most importantly, taught me forgiveness, moving forward, and to just pray. To all the children that lost their lives, Richard Cardinal and Jordan River Anderson, whose lives were short-lived. To my children who struggled with the addictions and being my teachers in this crisis. I would not have the awareness and understanding, nor the immense compassion for our people that are still struggling. To the survivors of the residential school, 60 Scoop, and the foster care system, let us shed off the layers of pain, shame, and struggles and reroute back to our land identity and ways of knowing. And to Lana and the team behind the scenes that offered us this time together, I thank you. Again, next slide.
Thank you. Thank you, Fran. And if you could see the, be standing ovation, the heart and the love coming from, I'm a bit speechless. I think there's a lot that I've learned and a lot that, we need to really give thought and heart to. And recognizing that the child removal history and the policy wasn't just residential school. It wasn't just 60 Scoop, but it actually has led to what we see and what's happening in our community and with our young people. And your story is so remarkable of how you've shared that and how you've shared key initiatives around how we move forward, but yet looking at the ways around how what works for us is actually going back to who we are and where we came from. And thank you so much for demonstrating that through story. And I know I've shed a few tears watching this. I've known you all of my life, but want to say I've learned something from you, and you've given me a lot of hope. And hopefully to those watching and to those that will watch this really deep understanding of what's happened to us, what we need to do to move forward, what we need to do to start to look back of where we came from. Because a lot of times we think the child removal happened years ago or it's over. We know it's still happening today. And in my lifetime, when I actually gave birth to my son and my daughter, although they're not birth alerts, they come with needing, even the social worker had to clear me. And I was a physician, I was a nurse, I was a well supported individual, and I was still treated this way. And I often think in those situations, here I am as a doctor being treated this way. What is happening to my people who don't have those letters in front of their name or don't have the privilege that I do, because I do recognize my privilege. So I think it's a clear reminder of the work we still need to do, the education and the understanding. And like I said in the beginning, of how we got here and where we need to go going forward. We thank you all for joining us today in this powerful last 90 minutes of incredible story, incredible heartfelt movement that's going to continue to propel us forward with truth telling. We thank you so much for being here and we welcome your feedback. If you have any questions about, particularly around the settlement, you could go to the website, which is firstnationschildclaims.ca. You can also call, which is 1-833-852-0755, or you can email generalinfo@contact.fnchildclaims.ca. And just as a reminder, for all, taking care of yourself, not only today, but always. If you need, just to talk with someone, to connect, you can always reach out to Hope for Wellness, which is a national program. And you can contact them at 1-855-242-3310, or locally if there's mental health supports available for you. Again, thank you so much for joining us today. We look forward to reconnecting. And for the questions online we did not get to, we will get a response back to you with the best of our ability. Have a great day, everyone. Thank you again. Take care, and we'll see you tomorrow. Gadamatsan.